Hey everybody, welcome back to another week, another session in our intro to Biblical Hebrew. We're just clipping right along through these Hebrew sentences and getting everything we need to build up to translating full narratives even. So the one we're getting at today is an important one. We're going to look at independent personal pronouns. And this won't be the last that we see of pronouns. We've kind of carved this chapter in Ross into two different parts. We'll look at what we find on page 94 today, and then we'll build on that with demonstrative pronouns. So in many ways, what we cover in this session will be foundational for the next session. And if you have flipped ahead even further in our grammar, you'll see that this is not the last that we'll see of our pronouns. Eventually we'll have pronominal suffixes, which sounds like a whole lot of fun, to put on the back end of verbs. So these pronouns, again, we're going to be into one of those areas in our course where if we learn something well at the foundational level, then when we encounter it later on, even next week or later on with verbs, it'll be less foreign to us, and we'll kind of build on this knowledge base we already have. So stay tuned for those things, but just to be aware that we'll deal with this now, and they'll come back later on. So for today, what's on the docket is getting a handle on the form of these personal pronouns. We're going to look at a paradigm that will be important for us, and something of their function. We'll extend in their function next day when we deal with demonstrative pronouns, but a few words on that here would be helpful. So working on recognition, forms, paradigms, and a few items of syntax. So why don't we get started with that? So let's start here by looking at the basics of these Hebrew pronouns, these independent personal pronouns, or IPPs we'll call them. Here's a list of 5 things that we'll look at here in this lesson, and the last 2 items there we'll look at in more detail in a slide or 2. Before we get into the basics of Hebrew pronouns, one thing to address would be, what is an English pronoun? Many times I think we've seen part of our challenge in learning Hebrew or any foreign language, whether it's a living language or ancient language, is that our English grammar ain't so good. We need to kind of pause and ask, what is a pronoun? We'll do that a little bit when we meet together in class, but really the short story is pronouns are those words that refer to another noun in a sentence. These are he, she, you, I, they, we. They point back to another noun in a sentence by those pronominal forms. And we'll look at some examples of that and talk a bit more over that in class. But here's what we're talking about, those he, she, you, they words that stand in for a noun that's already been stated earlier on in a sentence or earlier on in a narrative. So if that's really quickly our kind of high school English lesson of English pronouns, what is a Hebrew pronoun? Here's kind of the basics, so let's move through some things on this list. The first thing we want to talk about is that these are independent personal pronouns. That word independent is an important one because we've seen a few things like this in Hebrew already, like some of our prepositions that will stand alone in a sentence. Al or el, those type of words that will stand independently in a sentence, or in some cases be joined with a makef. Now remember, our makef is that line that joins, if we kind of add on to our example down here, like that. There's our pronoun hu, means he, and kohen means priest. Those could be joined to the makef, and that would be fine. They're not in this example, so we'll take it out. But think pronouns, think independent. You'll see them in a sentence on their own, or at most they'll be joined with what follows with a makef. So that's kind of the first point to think about. Now the second thing is something that's probably not news to us at this point. Because pronouns are standing in for nouns, they are inflected as our nouns were. So we're going to see they're inflected for a few things. We're going to see inflected for gender. They'll either be masculine, feminine, or common gender in the first person, as well as inflected for number. They'll be third person, second person, or first person. So because they're pronouns, we have some of those similarities with the noun system. So we'll keep an eye out for those things as we move ahead. The next few things have more to do with syntax. One of the things that we can see right away that would be helpful to kind of have in place for when we eventually deal with sentences is at times it can be difficult to sort out what is the object, what is the subject in a sentence, and there's a few things that can be helpful in terms of identifying those. In our world of pronouns, one issue you want to be aware of for syntax is these independent personal pronouns will always, always, always relate to the subject of the sentence. They'll never relate to the object. So if you're translating a sentence and you have a independent personal pronoun just hanging about, it can never be the object. It must always be the subject. So keep that in mind, and that will keep you out of some dangerous situations when you're translating real live Hebrew sentences. So that would be one thing on syntax. Now these last two items on the list we'll talk about just briefly here because we'll end off our lesson by looking at a few more examples. These have to do also with syntax, but with function of pronouns. How will they function in a sentence? There's a few ways. These are probably the two main ways that we'll see. One of them is that independent personal pronouns can function alongside of a verb. And when this happens, it's showing emphasis in a sentence. And we'll look at some examples of this later on. One of the things that we know about Hebrew verbs is that they can have a subject implied, built into it, right? Subjects are implied and built into verbs because they're inflected for person, gender, and number. So in a way, when we add a pronoun, we're doubling up on the subject, and that will be for emphasis, as we'll see later on. If that's the first point here, the second point has to do with when we have a verbless clause. Again, we've seen that in Hebrew, unlike in English, we can have verbless sentences, and that's okay. We'll see some examples of this in this lesson. When that happens, one of the things that we can do see from time to time is an independent personal pronoun that's standing alone in that sentence without a verb now, but it's standing in that place to indicate the subject of a sentence. I've got an example of this here to show us because it's a little bit abstract perhaps, and this is one coming from our workbook. Here's an image up on the left. This is our everybody's favorite patriarch. This is Abraham, and he's tithing to Melchizedek, this king of Salem. Now, this is an interesting passage in Genesis 14 that gets picked up, especially in Hebrews 7, I believe, and interpreted kind of theologically about what did it mean for him to tithe to this king. That's a later development, but for us at the Hebrew, what's going on way back in Genesis 14? Well, here's the passage that we're dealing with here that's talking about this little scene, and it uses a pronoun. So why don't we read it in Hebrew, and then we'll translate it, and then we'll move on. Vehu kohen le'el elyon. So that was Vehu kohen le'el elyon. Now, if we want to kind of move through the sentence, we could translate this as a noun. This means priest. We know that this here is a inseparable preposition, le. El elyon is a theophoric term. It means God Most High. You see this show up in some places in the Hebrew Bible as well as in early Jewish Aramaic literature especially. But the only thing we haven't dealt with is this, and we'll see in a minute that this is one of our pronouns. It simply means he. So here we have it, we could translate and or now he is or was a priest, Kohen, to God Most High. So that's an example where now that we at least know a little bit about verbs in Hebrew, what we're not seeing in here is a verb, and the way that we're translating is to supply a verb, is or was. And we're able to do that because we have this independent personal pronoun that tells us the subject, and the subject is he. The subject is this guy right here, Abraham. So that's the basics, probably more than the basics, to be honest with you, but those are some of the things we want to know about these pronouns. They stand independently, they're inflected for gender and number, they always relate to the subject, and they can be used to emphasize the verb in a sentence or indicate the subject in a verbless sentence. So why don't we move on now and have a look at our master paradigm. So there you have it. Here's our master paradigm. This is coming out of our textbook on page 94. So star that one, dog ear the page, come back to it, memorize it. This is one of the ones we definitely want to know. We'll use this in our exercises this week. We'll go over it in class together. But there's a few things happening here that we could at least just talk about and acknowledge, and a few ways that we can try to remember some things on this paradigm to aid us in memorizing or at least recognizing different forms. We could start by noting the obvious. There's no dual here. The pronouns relate to that world of nouns, but that dual, if that was confusing, then great, it's not here. Don't worry about it. That only applied to regular nouns. What we do see is we have singular and we have plural. So we have, we said that we could inflect these for number. That means 3, 2, and 1, as well as for singular and plural. So we want to be aware of that. We also have gender. We have our masculine forms. We have also our feminine forms. And one thing we could note that we have seen now already when we were dealing with our verb system is that we have this first common form for the first person pronouns. So that's kind of where we're seeing that come in here again. Third, second, and first common. That common form is not masculine or feminine. It's common to both. That covers some of the basis of kind of the outer structure of this paradigm. Why don't we go through it? We'll say it together. If you want to say it out loud on your own, we'll go through this in our class again when we meet. Why don't we start from the singular, the 3ms, and work our way down here first. So let's go from the top. It's who, he, ata, at, and then we have two forms here that can show up. Ani, anohi. So I'm going to go from the top again. That was who, he, ata, at, ani, anohi. If we wanted to go through that in the English, we can see that we're moving from the third, second to first down to the genders he, she, and that could be it. Again, we'd have some sentences where we'd have a gender-neutral subject, and it could be he or it, or she or it. For the second person, in English, we don't really inflect or distinguish between, I should say, our translations for they're not gendered. We would say you. So in context, we'd have to pay attention to is this a masculine or a feminine you? But in our translations, it would both be you. And the same applies to our first common. We only have one form there. That is I. There's no gender. It's common. A few things that might help you remember some of these things. Again, sometimes we have some odd ways of remembering. At least I do. In Hebrew, a he is a she. A he is a she. That might be a way of remembering your third feminine plural. This one, who, is our most common form. Who is a he. I kind of remember those few things as a way of getting them to stick in our head. I would treat all of these as a vocab item. I'm going to ask you to memorize this paradigm, but my advice would be to make vocabulary cards or items in your list, however you're memorizing it, for each of these forms with their corresponding English forms, the singular as well as the plural. So having said that, why don't we look at the plural forms, and we'll run down the list of them here very briefly. You'll see that for these two forms, we have two possible forms that show up with some variation, not unlike our first common singular. And those are heim, hema, and hein, heina. If we move down the list, let's look at our second masculine and feminine forms. Atem, atena, and our first common in the plural, anachnu. So let's go from the top one more time, and then we'll pause on a few of these forms. Heim, hema, hein, heina, atem, atena, anachnu. Okay, well, let's look at a few things in here. In terms of how to remember some of these, because now we get some similar sounding forms, one thing that sticks in my mind is our masculine forms have these mems. There's our mems in the third masculine, as well as in our second masculine. I think M for masculine, and you get hem, hema, atem. You're hearing that mem in there. If that's helpful, great. If not, forget I said it. But masculine forms have that M. That might be a way of helping distinguish them as you memorize or when you see them in context. On the English side of the paradigm with these glosses, you'll see here that again, as was the case with our forms for you on this side of the paradigm, in English we don't differentiate, we don't have gendered third masculine or third feminine forms. It's simply they. So that's English, but in Hebrew we do have gender, so be aware of that. In translation, you would simply translate they and make it clear from the context what you're referring to. One of the most beautiful things of biblical Hebrew is this form here. These second masculine and feminine plural forms. A great way of thinking about this in English would be y'all, you all. We don't use it a whole lot in our neck of the woods up here, but that term y'all is a plural for you all. That's really what this is talking about here for our plural. In English, in at least Western, non-Southern English, we'd probably say just you. But one way to kind of lock this in your mind as a plural would be to remember that we're talking about a y'all here, a you all. And then lastly, our first common form, anachnu, would simply be we. So if we have that whole paradigm before us, there's hopefully a few things that are helpful to remember as we try to get that ingrained in our minds. I would treat them as vocab. Try to remember some of these little tips along the way. The he is the she, the mem is in the masculine forms. That might help you. In terms of forms, that really gets at everything we need to know about these independent personal pronouns. So why don't we finish off the day by looking at a few ways that they function in a Hebrew sentence. So here we're coming full circle to where we started off on that second slide. We had the basic background of these IPPs in Hebrew, and the last few items on that list had to do with syntax. The kind of overview or the kind of big picture there was that these IPPs, these independent personal pronouns, will always relate to the subject of a sentence. So regardless of the syntactical function, it will always be in some way related to the subject. But under that umbrella, there's really two main uses of these IPPs that we want to worry about or be aware of at this point in time. So let's look at a few examples so we're not always just thinking and memorizing paradigms and vocab. What do these look like? Well, here's two that will illustrate the point. The first one here is an example of where we have an independent personal pronoun in a verbless sentence. And in that situation, it will be indicating a subject. Now, in English, as we all know, you need to have a verb in every sentence. Otherwise, it's a sentence fragment and it doesn't make sense. In Hebrew, we've seen this before a few times, that it's possible to have a verbless sentence. And when that happens, we simply need to supply a form of the verb to be. And that will always be a simple form of the verb, like is or was, or if it was plural, were or are. That we need to supply in English. So that's to make sense on our end. It's not a problem with Hebrew, it's a problem with English. So when we come across one of these sentences, like this first one, we know at least a little bit about verbs, and if we walked through the sentence, we would see very quickly there's no verb. Let's look at it and we'll see how the IPP helps us sort this out. So the Hebrew, hu, there's our pronoun, our 3MS pronoun. Ha-shofet, ha-yashar. Hu, ha-shofet, ha-yashar. So we should be able to recognize everything in here at this point. This one right here is our topic of the day. There's our IPP, that's he. We have here is an attributive adjective, the upright judge. If we're going to translate this, we would probably say he is an upright judge. Now, the is, we need to supply in English, but the pronoun, the who, is indicating the subject, that it's a he. And our translation, he is an upright judge, even though it sounds indefinite. In Hebrew, when we have a pronominal reference like that, it's automatically definite. So we could say he is an upright judge, or if it was contextually appropriate, he is the upright judge. Both would technically be correct. For the topic that we're covering today, the main thing is to be able to identify that we have a verbless sentence, we imply a verb of is or was, and the subject is given to us by the pronoun, in this case who, so that 3ms. He is an upright judge. So verbless sentences, when you see an IPP in the middle of it, remember it can only ever relate to the subject, and that's giving you a hint, a major hint. If it's a he, a she, a they, a you, whatever it is, that's telling you the subject of an implied verb. So that's type number one, a few words on function. Well, let's look at number two. Again, this falls under the category of uses of IPPs, as they will only ever relate to a subject. But where things are different here is that even though we've only dabbled in verbs, we can identify a verb in this sentence. An independent personal pronoun can appear alongside of a verb to emphasize its subject. Let's look at a few things in this sentence to see what we're talking about. So the Hebrew would be ata, asita, chesed, gadol. Again, that was ata, asita, chesed, gadol. The translation here, if we kind of work off of what we know, we would be able to identify, hopefully at this point, this is an adjective. Great loving kindness, that term chesed is for the term describing God's steadfast love or fidelity to the covenant type of love that he has for Israel. His great love, that's working together. We should also be able to identify at this point that this is a verb. That's a simple cal perfect verb, asita, there's our ending. Now the new part for today is this item here, and this item is our pronoun. Now when we take these two together, we have somewhat of a redundancy because our cal verbs, any Hebrew verb, has the subject built into it. We said this earlier in the session. Without that pronoun, we could already recognize that this would say, you have shown great steadfast love, simply because of the pronominal referent already indicated by that verb. Now in Hebrew, when we have a pronoun put in that sentence alongside of a verb, that emphasizes the action of the subject. So that's why in our translation, we would put something like, you yourself. It's really emphasizing that this is an action by this subject, a surprising action, an important action, whatever it is, it's emphasizing the subject. So it's doubling up to show that in the Hebrew syntax. So when we think of independent personal pronouns, a few things to remember. Always about the subject. They're only joined with words they relate to by a makef. Otherwise, they're independent, like some of our prepositions. When we find them in a sentence, they'll relate to a subject, or in the example above, they'll provide a subject when a verb is not present. That paradigm that we looked at will be helpful for us. Again, treat those as vocab items. Moving forward, we're going to see some of those same forms again, only functioning as what we'll call demonstrative pronouns and adjectives. And then some of those forms will look similar to what we find on pronominal suffixes on verbs. So all that to say, invest in that paradigm, know it, and treat all of those forms within it as vocab words, and that should be very helpful for moving ahead.